don't know if I'm the appropriate one to be talking about this or not, but I'm going to talk about some of the work that we have done at Southern Piedmont Center and some of the agronomic work. And John, particularly when we talk about the cultivar evaluation trials that we did and the dry and temperature trials, we'll talk about that. First, I want to say that I am the tobacco specialist, so hemp's a little bit far afield for me, except for the fact that we had so much interest in hemp in Southside Virginia, where our tobacco growers are, that it was just natural to try to support our tobacco growers in Southern Virginia in the hemp. And so that's how I became involved in this. And we received some funding from the Tobacco Commission for this effort. I want to acknowledge that. And the goal here was really to create a research and extension program here at the Southern Piedmont Center, similar to what we've had for tobacco for the last 45 years. And develop some resources to help our growers with production problems that they may have in the greenhouse or field, similar to what we do with tobacco, and try to identify problems and then try to work out solutions. And then we also wanted to develop or foster some industry collaboration as well. Just real quick, some of the trials that were conducted, and you'll hear about them later this week. In fact, Dr. Fleshner conducted some herbicide trials here at Blackstone, the variety or cultivar trial that I'll talk about today. We had some fertilization work underway. Katie Britt and Tom Kuhar had a budworm insecticide trial that worked very well last year. Dr. Johnson had a leaf spot fungicide evaluation as well, and then the dry and temperature comparison we had. So with that, I'll move in and talk about some of the work that we did do and look at the varieties that we evaluated last year. If you remember back, this time last year, our whole world changed in terms of the COVID pandemic, and trying to get varieties, get plants became difficult because we had travel restrictions and certainly couldn't go out of state to get any plants. So it was difficult. We had to work with a number of different plant providers to get plants for this trial. And I'd originally wanted to do some different work with planting dates and comparing clones and seed varieties and look at sources of plants, but it became too difficult to get that many plants and to get that arranged. So we did do a variety trial. We had 22 CBD varieties, and we had one CBG variety that I won't talk about today. But so here are the varieties we looked at. And on the left, I call those the group of 9. Those were just sourced together, and we planted those together. And then the ones on the right, that's my group of 13, and we just planted those a week or so later. So we separated them out that way and look at them separately. Just some basic production practices information. Obviously, I would follow the tobacco production model. That's what we did. Had 48-inch row spacing like we use for tobacco. A little bit different from tobacco. We did plant this flat, and we cultivated with what I would call a minimal dirting cultivation. So we plowed it, but we did not throw soil to the row, to the plant, did not build a row ridge. I left it somewhat flat, a little bit unlike tobacco. No pre-plant herbicides. We did use a biological root stimulant in the transplant center water. It also had a high phosphorus starter fertilizer. And actually, I think we saw a benefit from both of those. We used our normal tobacco fertilization program and fertilizer materials, had granular NPK fertilizer at planting. And then we drip irrigated and then fertigated with nitrogen and potash throughout the season. Some of the data that we collected, I was largely interested in just how the different varieties grew, how their growth habit was different. Shortly after we planted, it became obvious that uniformity was something that we needed to look at. So we took a lot of photographs and drone imagery just to to document the growth habit of the plants and differences in uniformity between the varieties. We had 3 in-season THC compliant sampling dates, and then we looked at yield, obviously, and then a full cannabinoid profile of the dried, processed, harvested material at the end of the season. Brandon's lab there did all of the analysis for this work for us. So these are just some photographs of one plot. Just want to show you, examples of some of the information we collected, just looking at, just taking photographs of individual plants in a plot and looking at the differences between size. Sometimes we'd see differences in just how the plants grew themselves, but this was an example there in July, late July. That variety was reasonably uniform. Here's one that was later on in August, a couple weeks later, a lot more growth by that time, but this was an example of a variety that was quite uniform, just in appearance and size. And that would contrast with this example, where we had a tremendous range in size on this variety, not just in this particular plot, but we replicated all these 4 times, and all the plots, all the replications of this variety showed this kind of range in size over the plots. Just another shot of the field, and again, just another photograph of the type of information we took. Just some of the varieties did very well. That stray cat there on the left looked good, looked uniform, had good size to it. And then we had some varieties that did not do well, and that's why we do variety tests. Some varieties are going to be better adapted to some production areas than others. So this is an example of one that did not do particularly well. And then we took photographs later at harvest. So we've got a lot of information, just how the plants look, just general shape of the plants, architecture, what the terminal cola looked like as well. So we'll move into looking at some of the data. This is those group of 9 that I mentioned, and the CBD is on the left and THC is on the right. And you can see that, the 3 sample dates before we harvested, obviously, as you'd expect, we'd get a trend in CBD over time as we approach top harvesting. On the THC side, we had 2 of these 9 varieties that went hot on us, and we had some high numbers above 0.5. One there was particularly hot. 7 of the 9 varieties were between 0.3 and 0.5% THC. These are the same data, but now I've added the final sampling, and that's the harvested, dried, processed material, and then we would sample it out of the boxes from each plot and added that to the graph. So when we look at this, the CBD of these 9, it looks like there's a trend for actually, we started getting a drop off in CBD values there between the 9th of October and our harvest. Looking on the right at THC, we had 1 of the 9 that was above 0.5%. 5 of them were between 0.3 and 0.5, and then 3 of them were less than or equal to 0.3%. And I believe that would be the hemp berry, cherry hydro, and the auto 2. The auto 2 was one that I really didn't pay a lot of attention to. That didn't stand out to me in the field early, but later in the season, as we got near harvest, that was a variety I thought kind of stood out. And then looking at the numbers there, it looked pretty decent. Looking at the other 13 varieties in the test, again, CBD values increased. You can see over our sampling intervals there, we had a good trend increasing in CBD values to the 17th of October. THC, this would be our compliance testing. They started, some of them started getting high. We had 5 that were above 0.5%, and 8 of the 13 were between 0.3 and 0.5. And then with our sampling of the harvested material at the end, CBD we saw a pretty clear trend among most of these 13 varieties where we had a drop off in the CBD between our last sample date and then the harvested material. I don't know if that's just a natural, perhaps some natural degradation of the product, or it's something related to how we dried this material and processed it, maybe diluted something in that process. And then THC, 8 of the 13 were above 0.5%. 3 were between 0.3 and 0.5, and then only 2 were right there at 0.3%. And that would be the Sweeten and the Late Sioux were right there at 0.3 in our final harvested material processed. So yield obviously is important, and that's what we see here is the yield across these 22 varieties. And you see we had quite the range in yield with the Bubba Kush there at the top with our lowest yield, just at 250 pounds. That was a variety I thought looked good in the field, actually, but it had a unique architecture with basically one large central terminal cola and not a lot of branching off of it. And then you can see we increased from that up to maybe 3,300 pounds there with the cherry wine. Now, I mentioned I was interested in comparing seed versus clones of the same variety. We're only able to do that with Boax. I will show you, how those two did differ. The Boax clone, we yielded 3,000 pounds to the acre. With the seeded plants, 1,500 pounds to the acre, just over 1,500. And then we look at the chemistry of those two. THC, both of them are above 0.3, but actually quite close together. They're at 0.45 and 0.49% THC. And then CBD, reasonably close again, 9.7 and 10.8. So I didn't see the difference in chemistry that I might have been looking for, but obviously we had a significant difference in the yield between clones and seeded plants. And I'll show you a photograph comparing these plants in a few minutes. And then finally, just want to highlight those bottom, or not the bottom, but the highest yielding plants. And look, the cherry one, the highest yielder at 3,300 pounds. THC right there at 0.35%, and CBD just under 9. Spoke about the Boax clones a minute ago. The Auto 2, 0.3% THC and 9.3 CBD, and again yielding right at 3,000 pounds. And then the Stray Cat and Late Sioux below those right there at 3,000 pounds as well. Excuse me, the Auto was the legend there. Can't see that. 3,500 pounds or 3,000. Excuse me. So that was our variety information, and I realized you can't see an awful lot from those graphs. There's a lot on those graphs, but if you're interested in actually getting a copy of the data, I can send you some of that information, and I'll show you my email in a few minutes at the end of the presentation. And please feel free to email me, and I can send you those data. When we were in the middle of the season and everybody was sampling and for THC compliance, and some samples are coming back hot, and then we had a discussion on exactly what portion of the plant, we should be sampling. Obviously, we need to be sampling the terminal cola. That's the protocol. But what would be the impact of sampling below the terminal cola? So I went out and I sampled the plant. I cut the plant in thirds: upper third, middle third, bottom third, and then also sampled the actual terminal of the plants. And these results that we got back, and I was somewhat surprised by this, that it wasn't nearly the difference that I was expecting, but I don't know any better. uh, between the terminal and particularly the upper third, maybe even the middle third here was sweetened that we sampled in terms of THC. The CBD dropped off as we'd expect. And then we have you can see what the end harvested product looked like, how that compared, but did not get the difference that I was expecting between the terminal and the upper third or middle third of the plant. So that was the first date, and those numbers kind of surprised me. So we sampled again, and then we sampled Bayox or Boax on this date. Again, same protocol, terminal and upper third, middle third. Again, these plants are obviously hotter in THC, but again, we did not see what I was expecting with a significant drop off in the THC numbers between the terminal and the remainder of the plant. So again, those weren't the numbers I was expecting, so we did it again. And this time we had late Sioux, and we harvested that or sampled this on the 4th of November. And again, the numbers are lower, but we still don't see the difference between the terminal and the remainder of the plant in terms of THC that I was expecting. So perhaps that's something we can discuss, and I certainly need to talk to the more folks that have more experience with this one. I did not see the differences that I was expecting. And all of these were replicated. Each of these, we sampled multiple plants to get these numbers. The next topic is the hemp drying work, and you know, my work with tobacco involves curing tobacco, and we do a lot of work with curing research. And on the left there are some curing chambers that we have for tobacco, where we could put 70, 75 pounds in these little tiny barns and do replicated curing work. So we use this to evaluate the drying temperatures for hemp. And so we looked at drying hemp at 95, 115, 135 degrees. Obviously, the length of drying is going to change the warmer we're running the barns, but you know, those are the temperatures that we ran the barns. And then on the right, you can see what we did to fill those barns. We would take the plants and basically delimb them, take the stalk out of them, and rack them. And we would have about 25 pounds of green material in these barns. We also, we compare these drying temperature treatments to an air cured check treatment as well. And that's what we see here is just one of the harvest dates where we had sticks that we had twisted plants on to dry and just hanging them in a protected spot. So we did 4 weekly harvest and drying cycles. We had 4 dates that we did this, 2 barns for each date. And we're doing full cannabinoid profiles on these, as well as terpenes analysis. And we're running these through the Institute for Higher Learning there in Danville, through their testing lab there. And so far, we've got the cannabinoid data back. We're waiting on then that's coming very soon. We're waiting on the terpenes and other flavor compounds. And perhaps that's where the biggest impact is going to be on the flavor compounds. But just real quick, showing you some of these data with looking at CBD. And we've got the 4 harvest dates. So we repeated this 4 different times. We've got the air dried column. And then you've got the 3 drying temperatures, 95, 110, 135. It was interesting. I guess the difference we see in the CBD values between the air dried and the forced air temperature treatments that we had, the air dried, we did have an increase in the CBD values on those. Not nearly the difference between 95 and 135 that I would have expected to see, though. But again, this is just CBD. THC, a little interesting there that the THC is actually higher on the air dried samples, as you can see there. Just take October 1, that harvest 0.58% for the air dried, then our temperature treatments, 95 to 135, ranging from 0.37 to 0.44%. But again, perhaps the biggest impact is going to be on the other flavor compounds that are in this material. So we're still waiting for that. I want to say a little bit about the root systems of these plants, and that's something that I've been particularly interested in. My background has been tobacco, and our greenhouse grown tobacco plants, we plant those in the field. All the rooting that occurs from that tobacco transplant occurs above the original root ball. So it's going to root from the stem that's below the soil line, but above the root ball from the greenhouse. And we're throwing soil to the row to increase the amount of rooting that we're going to get off the stem. So that looks quite a bit different with the hemp. And that was some of the discussion that we've had with growers. How much soil should we throw to the hemp plant? When we plow, should we throw a lot and encourage rooting or not? When I look at these plants that we dug up, you can see with the soil line is that transition there between the white of the stem and the green. And there's actually very little rooting that occurs from the stem of that plant. It's occurring. The root growth we're getting is from that original root ball, and we're not getting adventitious roots that are coming from the stem above that root ball. So that impacts a lot of things. That perhaps we should not be throwing soil to that stem and subjecting it to some of the pathogens that could be in the soil and injuring the stem perhaps. And that's going to impact how the plant anchors itself in the soil against weather conditions. Before I leave this slide, I want to just to highlight what is actually I'm showing you that slide. That's the Boax plants that we had, and on the left is the seeded, and on the right is a clone plant, and very much difference between the size of those plants and the rooting of those plants. It was consistent across a lot of plants that we examined. But remember back, the seeded plant yielded 3,000 pounds compared to seeded yielded 1,500 pounds compared to 3,000 pounds for the clone plant. Something else that I've seen a lot of with the hemp, and we've dug up a lot of hemp plants over the last year or two, and there's a lot of root girdling that occurs with these clone plants. And these plants were dug up, and they look good in the field. You would say they look good, but then when we look at the root system, the roots are growing on themselves, are growing around the base of the stalk, and potentially girdling the plant itself. So we see this occurring in the field a lot. Plants that are stressed and they wilt and then die. And obviously the first thing we think about might be insects that have attacked the stem, or a disease that's attacked the root or the stem. But what I'm seeing on a lot of these plants are severely girdled plants. And look at the one there on the right. Those roots did not grow outside the volume of that original greenhouse transplant cell. So in my mind, that's subjecting that plant to potential stress because it just cannot grow enough root system to support itself. So then, what is the role of this as a mortality factor for the plants? A lot of the plants that I've dug up that have died or in the process of dying, a lot of what I see is where we've got severely girdled root systems on these plants. Sometimes we'll see pathogens on that. That's Fusarium on this one. What comes first, the chicken or the egg, or the poor root system, or the pathogen that attacks it? And can this poor root system on this plant subject it to, or make it more vulnerable to pathogens that are going to be in the soil that we're growing this in? So that's something I'm interested in working with this coming year. Just the root systems of these clones and the quality of the root systems and how that's impacting the growth of the plants as we go forward. So John, that's what I have. Certainly thank everybody for participating today. I think we'll probably have time for discussion and questions later. There's my email. If you've got questions or comments that you want to talk to me about, we can do that. If you're interested in some of the data that I showed you with the cultivars, you can email me and I'll send you some of that information.